60% of Chicago voters disapprove of the union, and only 29% approve. And we hear from teachers all the time that are looking to get out of the union, to not pay dues to the union because they disagree with what the union is doing. Brandon Johnson was a teacher for just 4 years, and then he became a CTU operative. So they spent $2.3 million to ensure that one of their own became the mayor of Chicago. They spent the most on Chicago politics that year. They spent $6.5 million in the year leading up. And so it really comes down to them being a political machine and taking advantage of their political spending to get a political quid pro quo. You can love your teacher and not support the teachers union because they're two very different things. And I think that people are seeing that now. They're seeing that the teachers are separate and that the teachers unions are a political machine.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hello, this is The Contrarian, and I'm your host, David Bernstein. Today, I have a very special guest, Mailee Smith from the Illinois Policy Institute. I came across Mailee because she wrote this really important and powerful opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal about how a radical group of activists and DSA members in Chicago took over first the Chicago school teachers unions, and now is trying to do the same in the New York teachers unions. And it was really a wake-up call for a lot of people. This goes to the very heart of what we do. We're dealing not with some just ideological shifts in the water supply here, but we're dealing with actors who have actually taken over institutions, and we're dealing with a power shift. And so Mailee really helped illuminate that for us. Mailee, thank you so much for being with us, and I look forward to sort of exploring these issues with you.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself first, and then the Illinois Policy Institute.
Yeah, so like you said, I'm Mailee Smith. I'm the Senior Director of Labor Policy at Illinois Policy Institute and the staff attorney there. First of all, Illinois Policy Institute is a nonpartisan free market organization here in Illinois that is seeking to ensure every citizen, every resident of Illinois has the ability to achieve the American dream. So we are seeking common sense free market policies, whether that be budget and tax or labor issues or education issues, those policies that are going to benefit the citizens, the residents of Illinois. And so in that role, I'm obviously watching what's going on with the teachers unions, not only here, and really government unions overall in the state, because all of it is political. It's inherently political, and it's driving up costs in Illinois. But we're also watching what happens in other states as well, because we know that Illinois has long been a bastion of labor strength. And what gets tested here, a very blue state, and gets passed here, is often taken to other states. And so we want to make sure that people around the country know what's going on in Illinois, because it could be coming their way.
Absolutely. We say it a lot about California. What starts in California never stays in California. I think Illinois is another one of those feeder states nowadays, and it's become kind of known for setting the tone ideologically, which is really unfortunate and surprising in a way. I think, I'm from Ohio. We're mild-mannered people there. You wouldn't think that a place like Illinois would be such a hotbed of ideological fervor.
Right. Frequently, California, is labeled as, what happens in California is going to happen elsewhere. And I think Illinois just kind of slips under the radar for that reason, because it's a you look at it as flyover territory, right? It's Midwestern, it's farmland. Well, but we also have Chicago, and we also have decades of history of political corruption here in Chicago and statewide. For a while, we were actually averaging one conviction a week, I think, if you averaged it out over time, of government officials or employees for fraud and other various corrupt legal issues. So, because of this long history of an embedded political machine, union machine, there are a lot of very bad policies that come out of Illinois. They're tested here and then they're taken other places.
Yeah. I just heard something about the change in Chicago politics that I want to sort of run by you here. One longtime political hand in Chicago was telling me that what really changed in Chicago was that patronage system that you're talking about that was so susceptible to corruption actually sort of has fragmented. And it used to be that the mayor could have, would have all these people under his command or her command. I think it's always been his command, but could be wrong about that. And they would be loyal to the party and to the mayor and to the machine. But that has given way to something else that's much more fragmented. And as a result, it allows 20% candidates to come to power. In some ways, like it might be the argument he was making is that it's the dissipation of this corruption regime that has allowed radical ideologues to take a hold of whatever's left of that machinery. Do you agree with that?
I think there's something to that. Now, to the history of patronage, a lot of that fell apart when our longstanding Speaker of the House, Mike Madigan, he was actually the longest Speaker of the House in U.S. history for a state. So, historic position there. He is really the one that kept that patronage system going. But even he has been convicted now of wire fraud and other various things. So we see some of that patronage fragmenting, like you said. But what we have seen in its place arise is exactly what we're talking about today, which is the rise of Chicago Teachers Union and the really radical faction within the leaders within that union that have taken advantage of this situation. It's not something sudden. They've been planning this since 2010 when a radical faction took over called the Caucus of Rank and File Educators. They took over the union in 2010 and have been spinning this up into action. But when you look at 2023, in that year leading up to our mayoral and municipal elections, CTU and its state and national affiliates were the highest political spenders in Chicago. So they are very much vying for that spot of, the political machine. And in fact, when Brandon Johnson, who is the current mayor, was elected, the Chicago Tribune even wrote, is CTU the new political machine? And we have seen in the, couple of years following, that's very much the case.
Yeah. So what percentage do you reckon of the CTU are these radicals?
That's a fantastic question. I would reckon that it's actually fairly small. Mm-hmm. But, and they're actually experiencing their own election this month, May 16th, which is the end of this week. That's tomorrow.
That's tomorrow.
When we're recording. Mm-hmm. Tomorrow. So they are facing in their leadership election a very valid potential opposition. However, they are very embedded and they have the microphone. They have access to all of the teachers, this leadership. We do know that citywide, there is disastrous approval rating for the union. So we did a survey in January of this year, and according to that survey, 60% of Chicago voters disapprove of the union, and only 29% approve. And we hear from teachers all the time that are looking to get out of the union, to not pay dues to the union because they disagree with what the union is doing.
Yeah, so it's amazing, though, that this small faction, and you see this across the board in institutions, always seems to prevail. I mean, I guess they're more motivated by their ideological precepts. They're very good at it, and moderates seem, less able to mobilize. And so you have small factions controlling larger factions and dominating in a lot of institutions. And you're seeing that obviously in spades in the CTU, right?
We are seeing that. But, like I said, they control the purse strings. They have the megaphone. So this small group of leaders that is very radical, very progressive in disseminating their socialist agenda, they're the ones that control the website. They control the emails to their members. They control the message. And so they can alert members to what they do or don't want them to know, as opposed to opposition forces from within are quelched very easily. The leadership are bullies. We see that not just behind the scenes from stories that we hear, we see that very publicly. In fact, the Chicago Teachers Union had not, they're supposed to release an annual audit every year telling their members how they're spending their money. They hadn't done so for over 4 years. And when members were questioning online, hey, where is this audit? Stacey Davis Gates, who is the current president, went after them and bullied them online, accused them of basically using these requested audits as a racist dog whistle. So there is an element of fear that takes place. And we actually have a documentary on this rise within Chicago Teachers Union. It's you can see it at chicagoteachersunion.com. And in it, we've interviewed multiple teachers who tell their story of the bullying that happens behind closed doors.
Wow. I definitely want to see that. I definitely want to share that. Yeah, that's incredible. And we have a documentary about sort of the rise of ideologues in the California school system as well, called Hidden Agendas. And it just never ceases to fascinate me how this small group of people could be so potent in their advocacy and in their planning and everything else. So you described just now how these radical actors took hold in the Chicago Teachers Unions. What is happening in New York right now that we should be aware of?
So historically, the union there, the United Federation of Teachers, has not been able to go on strike. So they haven't been quite as militant as what we have seen in Chicago, because there is state law there that prevents the kind of strikes that we have seen in Chicago. But they are experiencing an election of their own this month. I believe voting is occurring through the month. It ends at the end of the month. And there are a couple of candidates for leadership who are backed by the Democratic Socialists of America, and they've called themselves the Movement of Rank and File Educators, or MORE, which is very similar to what we have in Chicago, which is the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, or CORE. And they are leading a slate seeking to oust the long-term leadership within the union there in New York. And, none of this is new to us in Chicago. This is the CTU playbook in action.
When are those elections? When are those elections?
They're occurring in May.
That's this month. We're in May.
This month, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So what are their chances?
Without being there on the ground, it's hard for me to say what I think will happen. But just historically looking at what happened with Chicago Teachers Union, with CORE, looking at the amount of support that CORE's leaders have from on high, from the American Federation of Teachers, I would assume that this leadership slate in New York is very much supported by the national leaders within AFT.
Really? Like I think AFT is highly problematic and highly ideological, but I would, I've also seen their leadership sort of stifle some of the most anti-Israel resolutions that have come up the ranks.
Yeah.
Do you think that they're supporting the most extreme voices within their local affiliates?
It's very possible. And again, I'm basing a lot of this on CTU's blueprint of political spending translating into political power. And that is what AFT and IFT, which is the state affiliate, are after. They're after that political power. And, CTU has enjoyed the AFT leadership's approval, even though they have issued multiple letters calling for, or they've joined multiple letters calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza. In January of 2024, CTU declared their support for a city council ceasefire resolution. They had CPS students hold a walkout the next day. So AFT has not come in and said, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. This runs counter to, our overall leadership agenda. It's very much allowed to be perpetrated and really blessed, I think, by the leaders on high.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. So here's the question I have, though. How does a teachers union that, let's say, is taken over by radicals then translate into a policy agenda in the schools? How do we go from a group of radicals winning in a union election to all of a sudden having schools that are dominated by this agenda?
Yeah, so it goes back to that political spending translating into the political power, or the legislative and the bargaining power. So a few things here that I would point out. So this slate of radical leaders took over in 2010. And they have been spending political money since then. So looking back to 2010, just looking at state lawmakers. So as of last July, they had given $1.3 million to sitting lawmakers, nearly half of the lawmakers in our state General Assembly, and 72% of Democrats. Many of them, nearly half of those Democrats, were not even in Chicago. So we make this point to people. I know New York could be very similar in their demographic and political landscape, where what happens in Chicago affects downstate. I know what happens in New York affects upper state New York. So what we have seen is that money to lawmakers translates into getting what they want. So that was in July of last year. They had spent $1.3 million at least on sitting lawmakers. We looked at what happened in that legislative session that ended in June, the month before, and CTU had gotten their way on 6 out of 10 bills that they lobbied over in that legislative session. So we see that money translating into legislative action in our state General Assembly. We also saw, so that's one thing, the money to the lawmakers getting what they want. We saw them take over the city and city hall as well. So they spent nearly $2.3 million to secure Mayor Brandon Johnson's election. And something that may not be widely known is that Brandon Johnson was a teacher for just 4 years, and then he became a CTU operative. So they spent $2.3 million to ensure that one of their own became the mayor of Chicago. They also, CTU and its affiliates, like I said, they spent the most on Chicago politics that year. They spent $6.5 million in the year leading up to Brandon Johnson's election. And in return, what do they get? They're bargaining across the table from their own former coworker in Brandon Johnson.
Right. And we know how that went.
Exactly. Yes. And so it really comes down to them being a political machine and taking advantage of their political spending to get a political quid pro quo.
And then the mayor appoints the superintendent of schools, correct?
Well, actually, yes and no. We're kind of in this middle ground right now. So
there's a transition going on.
There is a transition. Yes. So we have a CEO right now who Mayor Johnson and CTU have tried to oust over the course of the last year, because he was the one person sort of standing in the way of CTU getting everything they wanted in a contract that was just negotiated. At the time, CTU was looking at a $500 million deficit in their budget for the year. And we had one person, Pedro Martinez, who is the CEO, kind of standing there saying, we can't afford all of these things. And he was getting pressured from both directions, the union and the mayor, to take out loans, high interest loans, et cetera. So he's there, but he's leaving. And he will be appointed. And in the meantime, we've had sort of a hybrid. It's a very complicated system right now, because we are transitioning. We used to have a fully appointed school board of 7 people. We're now in a 2-year period where that is transitioning out. We have a hybrid school board. So it's part elected, part appointed. By the end of 2026, we should have a fully elected school board.
So
So at
will the
this point in time,
CEO be
CTU
will
controls.
the CEU be will the CEO of the schools be appointed by Brandon Johnson after Pedro Martinez leaves?
He will be nominated, and then he has to be appointed by the city, or not the city, I'm sorry, the school board.
Right. And so we're starting to elect some school board members that might have a different perspective. Are you seeing any positive signs that some of those new school board members might take a different approach?
We are. And in fact, even some of Brandon Johnson's chosen have pushed back a little bit on, for example, taking out a high interest loan as being irresponsible, or in fact, the initial 7 that he appointed refused to fire the CEO and instead stepped in en masse. They all resigned one day rather than fire the CEO. So we are seeing pushback there. We're seeing, like I said, pushback even from the people of Chicago. So, this is where there's hope. We can talk about how enshrined in the political landscape that CTU is, but we are seeing examples of their political power possibly starting to wane. And one is our school board elections, where the union spent $1.72 million on school board candidates leading up to the election in November, and they only secured 3 of the 9 open positions with their candidates. So the people of Chicago, like I said, they only 29% approve of the union. The people of Chicago are starting to see CTU, I think, for what it is, a power player that does not have the best interest of Chicagoans and students in mind.
Right. You may be blessed with having hit rock bottom. In a way, like the overreach.
That's the only way to go up.
Right. The overreach is so extreme and so obvious and so detrimental to kids and so detrimental to the city that people start to say, wait a second here, we got to wake up and do something. And as a result, you feel backlash. And a lot of other places I've seen, people don't know how bad things have gotten. And as a result, they sort of, they languish in the status quo. I think with Chicago, it was just too damn obvious that was happening.
Exactly. And we look at what has happened since 2010, when this caucus of rank and file educators took over. Since then, we've seen higher costs. So spending has, from 2012 to 2024, spending nearly doubled, while proficiency plummeted.
Yeah.
Fewer than 1 in 3 kids can read at grade level in Chicago public schools, and even fewer are proficient in math. And it's even worse for low income and minorities. We've seen, like I said, escalating strike activity. We've seen enrollment plunging. All the while, property taxes in Illinois are the 2nd highest in the nation. So people are really feeling this cost of a radical teachers union, driving up costs, and yet getting worsening results.
Right. If you actually look at this small faction of people that took over the union, it's amazing they've actually, in a way, destroyed the entire city, for at least a period of time. Hopefully, it'll be recovered at some point. But it's just astounding. It's how reverberating that those actions can be, and why it's so important to sort of retake power. That moderates retake power in this, which takes me to my thesis of an opinion piece that I wrote in which I quoted you quite extensively just this last week. And the article was in the Jewish Journal, the LA Jewish Journal, and it was called "Why Fighting Anti-Semitism Is Not Enough." And the thesis of the piece was that, a lot of times we think we can go into a system that where there's all this negativity, all this ideology, all this politicization of classrooms, and we can kind of take from the repertoire of tools that we've always done, advocacy tools, and try to modify the curriculum or, get a bad teacher out or whatever. And some of those things can work some of the time. But it seems to me that once a group of bad actors captures a system, you're fighting an uphill battle, and that the real play on the part of people who want to see change is to change those fundamental political dynamics, to flip school boards, to and bring other people into power, because otherwise you're going to be just playing a game of whack-a-mole. Do you agree?
Exactly.
Okay.
I agree with that. And bringing up the school board is a fantastic example, because that has been the overall, I talk about the blueprint or the playbook of CTU, but that has been the overall playbook of teachers unions nationwide, is getting people into the school board who are aligned with the teachers union. They actually, when I say playbook, I mean, there's actually documented instructions
I'm sure.
on here's what you need to do. You need to get on the school board. Here's how you do it. And the overall goal isn't just, I talk about political power and getting things passed, but you look at the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association and all of these locals like CTU and UFT, they're supporting something called bargaining for the common good.
Yes.
And that sounds very altruistic, like, oh, let's make sure everyone is secure and has the education they need. That's what it sounds like. But what it really is putting things on the negotiating table that aren't typically part of negotiations. And the main problem here is that bypasses the legislative process. The union is getting things in the contract that don't belong there. And
like
they're so, for example, in this last contract, well, I'm going to give a little history. Sorry.
Sure.
This really started in Chicago in 2012, where they walked out on strike. And what they prided themselves in at that point in time was getting things on the negotiating table that aren't normally there. So when we think about what's typically negotiated in collective bargaining agreements, it's wages, benefits, vacation time, overtime, things, healthcare, all of those sort of things that you would think of that are associated with your job. But what CTU has tried to do is, this is throughout the Bargaining for the Common Good website, they talk about racial justice, climate justice, immigration. So what we've seen specifically from the CTU, they've tried to defund the police. They want cash to asylum seekers, police-free schools, carbon neutral buildings. They wanted in this last negotiation to secure complete carbon neutrality in the district by 2035. The creation of housing, not just like, oh, here's a housing stipend for our teachers. It's actual creation of housing. So these are things, you may agree or disagree with them, but I think we can pretty much all agree these aren't things that belong in a collective bargaining agreement. Right. These are things that belong through the democratic process. If you want the city to create housing, that's something the city should do, not something that should be negotiated in a teacher's contract.
Yeah, so you have activists in teachers unions who are really promoting a larger agenda and trying to expand their power base based on these other goodies that they're able to get through. And it's really destructive for the whole city or the whole, because it usually leads to the kind of disaster we've seen in urban areas in the last decade or so.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So then the question is, like, do you all get involved in what's happening in school systems even after bad actors have taken over? And how do you think about those challenges while we're waiting for the next round of school board elections to take place?
Yes. So one thing that we have found incredibly important is exposing Chicago Teachers Union for what it is. We may look at it like, okay, they have millions of dollars that they're spending on politics. My organization is not spending, we're a C3 and we're not spending millions of dollars on politics. But what we can do is inform people and reach out to the people of Chicago and let them know what's really happening. And we do take some amount of credit for what has happened with Chicago Teachers Union and their abysmal approval rating, because people are seeing what's happening behind the scenes. So we dig into what's going on with the leaders of local unions and expose what's going on. And this is beneficial not just for the people of Chicago, but for the members themselves. They need to know what's going on because they're not hearing it from their union. So, examples of things that we have exposed and reported on include hypocrisy within union leadership. So, for example, in 2023, the teachers union was very active in decimating the one and only school choice option we had in Illinois, which was a taxpayer-funded tax credit scholarship. And the teachers union was against it. It was going to expire. In the meantime, we were able to expose that Stacey Davis Gates, the president of the union, actually had her own son in private school while she was crushing the educational options for low-income children. We've exposed things like she was taking a homeowner's tax break on an Indiana property she didn't live in, that she owed the city like $5,600 for utilities that she hadn't paid. Exposing these scandals, like she actually had a police report made against her for threatening physical violence against a principal, that she has cursed at other union leaders of other unions publicly. And so, letting people know what it's really like, letting teachers know what it's really like has been, I think, very evidently helpful in ensuring that the people of Chicago see the union for what it really is.
Got it. How about the state level and its role in education? I've seen the various initiatives, or I can't describe them to you off the cuff, of in social studies, for example, in Illinois, then translating into more radical agendas at the school district level. What role do you think the state government plays in all of that, in Illinois in particular?
Obviously, the state does dictate the curricular headings, let's say, of what need to be taught in school. But fortunately, for districts outside of Chicago or outside of the Chicago metro area, there's a lot of local autonomy. So they get to choose what the curriculum is. The state dictates that, XYZ subjects must be taught. The local districts themselves get to decide what that curriculum looks like. And that's where school board at the local level is very important, that people get involved and vote in the people that are going to best represent that district. But I will say that at the state level, we're also seeing some pushback now that we didn't used to see against CTU. So last summer, CTU and Mayor Brandon Johnson went to Springfield, and they were asking for the state to funnel an additional $1.1 billion to the school district after it had squandered its pandemic aid money, and that was rejected. CTU ruffled a lot of lawmaker feathers after labeling. There was a bill that was going to prevent the closure of some schools in Chicago. They labeled the supporters, who, it was a bipartisan bill and it was a Democratic sponsor, they labeled them as racist. So they being CTU labeled these lawmakers bipartisan as racist. Didn't set well with lawmakers in Springfield. So, it does seem that maybe CTU has overplayed its hand. You mentioned earlier that, sometimes you have to hit rock bottom. I also think that CTU, absolute power corrupts absolutely, according to Lord Acton. And I think what we're seeing is that they've overplayed their hand to some degree, and it's getting to be almost toxic to associate with the union if you're a lawmaker. That same survey that I mentioned earlier in Chicago indicated that 57% of Chicagoans would be less likely to vote for a candidate if they took union money. So there's another example of what we do is we follow the money and let people know who is getting money from Chicago Teachers Union, and how the union is spending money on politics in general.
Mm-hmm. Are you aware of any specific efforts around social studies or any of those fields that are particularly vulnerable to ideological takeover that are sort of starting at the state level and then filtering down to the local level, particularly in places where we're not in a good position with school boards?
Not in the last couple of legislative sessions, but I think it's because it's already happened in Illinois. So there's already been this push to broaden what must be taught in social studies to include all sorts of achievements or roles in history by potentially, I don't want to use the word woke, but I don't know how else to describe it. We'll just use the term that people know. So that is already in place. But like I said, local districts get to decide how that is implemented. This legislative session, I was encouraged to see that the majority of education-focused bills have been on literacy and trying to ensure that our children in Illinois can read because, like I said, fewer than 1 in 3 in Chicago can read at grade level. And so implementing more science of reading curriculum is something that we are seeing at the state level being pushed more often than some of the other issues.
Do you think that there's a consensus now that sort of phonics is the right way to go, and that the ideologues who, for whatever reason, wanted to teach whole language theory and what have you, that they're receding, and that even among maybe the teachers unions, even maybe a Chicago teachers union, they may start to move in that direction?
I do. And we saw this in Illinois on I'll just use one bill example. It was, in the scheme of things, it's not a overwhelming bill that it's going to fix the problem of low literacy rates in Illinois, but it is at least a start. And that was mandating that any professional development that happens within the public schools that involves literacy must be based on the science of reading and, phonics, and training teachers how to implement that. Which is important. It's kind of a missing piece. We've seen in other states that have rolled out literacy reform, it has come in multiple steps. And one of those steps is typically ensuring that teachers are trained in the science of reading and what that means. Getting away from something called 3Qing, which is trying to memorize the words and just recognize them. And that bill passed the House of Representatives in Illinois unanimously. And then it went over to the Senate, where it passed unanimously out of the committee and will be held for a vote. So bipartisan bill. It was actually the main sponsor is a Democrat, unanimous support. And I think it's really encouraging to see that, the teachers unions are not standing in the way of these common sense literacy reforms.
What's the role of the governor in all of this? Do you think the governor wants a more moderate agenda in Chicago, or do you think the governor is sort of playing to the teachers unions?
So that is a very interesting scenario right now, because Brandon Johnson, the mayor, who is aligned completely with CTU, you really can't separate them because he was one of their operatives. Brandon Johnson and the mayor don't seem to get along very well.
And the governor, you mean the
governor. Sorry. Yes. Yeah, Brandon Johnson and the governor don't seem to get along very well.
That's good.
And last year, when CTU went to the state capitol and was lobbying for this $1.1 billion, Pritzker had some harsh words for the union and said something about how it's not the job of Springfield to rescue school districts that were irresponsible with the one-time money they received through the pandemic. So, I think they're not misaligned. They're not on opposite sides, but I do think Pritzker is a little bit more careful about when he aligns with the union.
So let's just go up the ladder of abstraction for 1 second, big picture. And I'm going to ask you, do you think that the ideological winds have shifted away from this, and that people like you, people like me are now have the winds at our back here?
I hope so. I think that the last couple of years have played a role in this as well. And I don't want to ascribe too much to what has happened nationally with the presidential election, but I think that people have come back to seeing what really matters is their pocketbook and their children. Mm-hmm. And CTU and mayors like Brandon Johnson and Democratic mayors like Pritzker are failing on both of those counts. We in Illinois have had, just in the last 15 years, I think it's 70 new tax hikes, and our children's education is getting worse. And so I think that is what people are looking at. Like you said, maybe those winds have changed, and they're tired of hearing about many of those quote unquote woke issues, and they want to get back to the basics of being able to buy groceries and have children who read.
Yeah. So for groups like ours, we're the North American Values Institute, who are working very closely with parents to intervene. It's interesting. On the one hand, we have to get them to understand the problem. So sometimes you have to go into the whole sort of woke lexicon and show them, okay, well, culturally responsive education may not be what you think it is, or social emotional learning may not be what you think it is. But once you actually bring that to this public sphere, you might want to get back to sort of the basics and say, look, what you're doing is not working. It's resulting in lower test scores. It's resulting in fewer kids being able to read at grade level. And that's the challenge, is sort of balancing those two things, at least from our standpoint.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what has also been hard is balancing with parents that my kids, my kids have run the spectrum of, I had two kids went all the way through 8th grade in a private school, and then they went to public school for high school. I have one that I'm currently homeschooling. But we love teachers, but it's been hard, I feel like, to this point, for parents in general to separate that teachers are not the teachers union. And so I think that's been another important wedge that has been driven, especially since COVID, when people were able to see what was happening with their students, that it's okay. You can love your teacher and not support the teachers union, because they're two very different things. And I think that people are seeing that now. They're seeing that the teachers are separate and that the teachers unions are a political machine.
And even among teachers, it's okay to say, maybe there are a few bad apples out there, and maybe one of them's teaching my kids too.
Right, exactly.
And and be open to that possibility. We can still support teachers writ large and understand that there's some activists among them that want to politicize the classroom.
Exactly. Yes. And that is something too that I think resonates with teachers themselves, when they see that teachers unions are protecting the bad apples rather than working for those teachers who are doing a fantastic job. The majority of teachers who are doing a fantastic job, care for their students, put their students first rather than politics. But those teachers, and we hear from them, like I said, we help them opt out of their unions. They're tired of seeing their teachers unions not only political, but supporting and ensuring that those bad apples get to retain their positions.
Absolutely. Well, Mailee, thank you so much for your time. I think this has been a really important discussion. Thanks for the sort of research that you did and exposing this problem, because I think you really shined a light on what can happen when a bad group of people, bad actors, take over an institution, take over a teachers union, and then use that to promote a very bad agenda that not only politicizes the classroom, but also leads to declining productivity in the classroom and lower test scores and lower reading rates. So really important work that you've done and are doing. And I really appreciate you sharing it with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.